At any rate, I just want to welcome you to the first of a series of 3 webinars by Dr. Phil Rich that NERI is offering this May on the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th. It's an overview of juvenile risk assessment, part 1, and this is a subject close to my heart. And before I turn this over to Phil, I should just explain why I'm here. I'm filling in for Joan Tabachnik, who usually coordinates these webinars and always is well known for her friendly voice and warm hospitality. So I hope to emulate some of that. But let me tell you a little bit about NERI Press. The NERI Press mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices that are emerging in our field, and they've done so for many years. For much of their history, this has been accomplished only through book sales, but with changes in both publishing and technology, NERI Press has been exploring what it means to maintain their mission while moving towards a more expansive view of the organization as a means of knowledge dissemination. And with that new goal, over the past 5 years or so, NERI Press has been offering online courses, free newsletters, face-to-face workshops, and now, most recently, these webinars by internationally recognized authors such as Phil. When seeking to determine the most pressing questions, the most urgent training needs, or the most desired presenters, NERI Press can accomplish goals better if they have your suggestions, input, and feedback. So whether positive or negative, we really appreciate the engagement with you, so please do contact us with your questions and critiques and suggestions. And so, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment with the poll question. I'm interested in how many of you have participated in a NERI Press webinar before. And as you can see, you can select one of the following, yes or no. And I'm seeing a little sign that says I'm not allowed to participate because I'm moderating. So I've done this before. And like NPR, National Public Radio here in the US, this is an international audience I see. There we go, about 67% saying yes, you've been in one of these before, 31% saying no. So this is a great big special welcome to those who are attending for the first time. It is your donations that help make these series happen. And this particular webinar series is currently being arranged, and we're excited to continue to offer presenters who are highly regarded in their fields. You can become a sponsor now, and by contacting NERI at the office. I'll have detailed contact information for you in a little bit. And I see now that that number has gone up to 71% have been in a webinar before. So I'm trying to advance my slide, and hopefully this works a little bit here. Let me just mention the learning objectives before we get started. At the conclusion of this series, webinar participants will, number 1, understand and be able to describe the juvenile sexual risk assessment process and instruments. Number 2, recognize the importance, process, and contents of comprehensive juvenile risk assessment. And number 3, to understand how the risk assessment process serves as the foundation for treatment planning and case management. Second, to let you know that the PowerPoint will be posted at the NERI Press website shortly after the webinar is over, and you'll be posting a recording. You'll also be receiving a recording of this webinar next week. Afterwards, you'll be sent a special Google Drive link that specifically gives access to these materials for all of the participants who have paid to be here. And last, when the workshop is over, be sure to close out your account and you'll receive an evaluation. And again, NERI Press really does love your feedback. And as one who is not employed by NERI Press, but very involved with it, I've been involved in many of the behind-the-scenes discussions about participant feedback. So, so that part is very serious. Please do feel free to contact NERI. The last thing to know is that after about a week, you'll receive a follow-up email that has a link not only to the recordings, but also certificates of attendance and information on how to get CE credits through Orlando Behavioral Health Systems. So, Tim, a quick check-in with you. Are my slides advancing at all? Is that working for you? I don't want to take too much. Yeah, okay. My apologies, folks. I'm sure that this will all work itself out. Again, we'll mention a couple of books in particular that are available from NERI. Joan asked me to mention one that I actually wrote nearly 10 years ago called Assessing Youth Who Have Sexually Abused, a primer. It's by me, and you can also pick up a copy of Juvenile Sex Offenders, Understanding, Assessing, and Rehabilitating Rehabilitation, which is now in its second edition. Congratulations, Phil. I should mention that Phil has also written an excellent book on risk assessment of juveniles who've sexually abused as well. So perhaps he can tell you about that. But I know he's got a very full presentation today. So let me just introduce Phil, who I've known for, I think, about 17 years now. I can't believe it's been that long. Dr. Phil Rich presents, trains, and consults nationally and internationally, and is currently in private practice as a consultant and trainer specializing in work with sexually abusive youth. Phil has worked extensively with sexually troubled youth and staff working with his client group and has written 4 books and numerous articles and chapters addressing the assessment and treatment of sexually abusive youth. If you're not familiar with Phil's work, that was actually a very minimalist introduction to him. But I think I'll just turn it over because you're about to find out all about Phil's talents and contributions to the field for yourself. So with that, please welcome Dr. Phil Rich. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Phil.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Okay, so now I think that you should be able to see my screen now. Do you see that? Empirical basis. See that first slide?
I do.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna say hello to everybody. Thanks. Hey, David, you should be an NPR announcer, I have to say. That was good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so look, I do have a lot of material. I'm going to keep an eye on the time. I'm going to take about 30 minutes. So without knowing where you are, that will put us, in terms of your time zone, will be about 3:40, which will give them time for questions and answers. And so I'm going to move through this quickly, and I may skip through a couple of slides. There's a handout for this that you'll be able to get, so you'll have all the material. And definitely feel free to contact me. And at the end, the last slide also has my name and contact info. And as David said, it looks like there's a lag between, you'll see as I go through each screen, or each slide, things will come up one bullet point at a time as I'm talking about them. For me, those things come up immediately. It sounds as though there may be a 3 or 4 second lag. So just be aware, I may be talking just ahead of what's going to appear on the screen. And again, if you have questions, just email them. You know what I mean. Write them and then submit them. And I think David or Tim will be getting those. So with no further ado, okay, the empirical basis. Actually, I will go back one slide. This is part of really a 4 episode series. The first, I'm not sure that we knew we were going to do 3 more. So the first, which is available online, was really a general overview. This and the next 2 will break it down into the process, and in this case, looking at the empirical basis. And we'll come back to that as the very last slide, just looking ahead at what those 2 are. I assume that everybody out there is also going to be attending those 2. I hope so. So just as a really brief primer here, or primer, as David might say, never sure the right pronunciation. There's an assumption that you know enough about risk assessment to be able to know what we mean when we talk about risk factors. I'll give in each case a very brief intro, and we'll talk more about it over the 3 sessions. So if you're not quite sure, just send it in as a question. Actually, somebody's got a question. I see the little light flashing. Let me just take a look and see if it's something. Okay. I don't see it. And I think David will take those. I just wondered about perhaps people didn't hear me or something like that. All right.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out on things.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So this piece, our literature has talked about risk assessment instruments for quite a long time, and we see more articles coming out that address this. Things have changed over the years, but really for the most part, we're going to see the same sorts of risk factors, if not as individual risk factors, as domains of risk factors. We're going to see these appear in most. We can think of them, I think, largely falling into these 10 areas. This is what we can expect to see when we do youth assessments in terms of those instruments, the way we think. We're going to be looking at their sexual beliefs as a category, what they believe, what their drives are, what their attitudes are. This is the static portion, the portion that looks back at what is, what has been, and what really cannot change as a platform for understanding where things are at now, where things may or may not go. The static history, what actually happened. Again, as a broad category, was this somebody who was in some ways physically victimized themselves? And that may mean a sexual victimization. It may mean an emotional victimization. What's their general antisocial behavior? Are they criminally versatile? Social relationships, are they connected to people? How about them? Are they narcissistic? Are they introverted? Their general psychosocial functioning. How do they do as a whole in the community? How about their family relationships and functioning? The environment in general. And finally, if they've been in treatment, and particularly if they've been in treatment for sexually troubled behavior, what would their response? So we see these as two general categories that we see risk assessment, risk factors typically falling into risk assessment instruments growing around. But despite the fact we've got that literature on risk and it continues to grow, it's mostly theoretical, it's mostly descriptive, it's not really in many parts, at least, the result of statistical research. So let's take a look at that, as today we want to look at empirical basis. So here's Spice and colleagues in video, the second person, second author, particularly important, Scalora Ullman as well, but Jody in particular has written a lot as part of an independent group of researchers who have looked at risk assessment instruments, sexual and non-sexual, for juveniles. And it's important that we know they're independent because it means that they're not, we hope, biased. They don't have a particular allegiance to a particular model. They have no axe to grind except to see are these really useful. That's important to know because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Significantly, that particular article notes that, unfortunately, when we do different studies on risk factors, they're shot differently. It's study to study. So there's a tremendous inconsistency. And it's not surprising because of that inconsistency that findings and studies vary from report to report. And the reality is that when we think about validity, when we think about, well, what is it? Are we measuring the thing that we think we're measuring? And we think we're measuring the potential or an estimate that somebody may re-offend. We will come back to that idea as we go through the day, or an hour, excuse me. We've, in fact, produced contradictory responses. We see some articles that say one thing about risk factors and another that says something very different about risk factors, sometimes inconsistent, sometimes contradictory. And as Spice and colleagues and McCann and Lucia say, idiosyncratic studies, there's no consistency across studies in terms of how we design the study, our samples, what we believe, our research questions or hypotheses, or even the statistical methods and procedures that we use. And as a result, we come up with different review of risk factors based on different articles. This is now a little bit out of date. 2006 seems like it was a couple of minutes ago, but it's 10 years ago, a little out of date now. But I think still an important finding because things haven't really changed very much for quite a long time in risk assessment, relatively speaking, juvenile risk assessment. They say that, in fact, most of the identified risk factors for juvenile sexual offending actually lack any empirical or statistical validation. So that's important to know. They cite 21, things have shifted a little bit, but not too much. They cite 21 commonly cited factors, and they say that only 5 of those actually had empirical support. And by that, that's a pretty low standard, really. 2 published independent research studies. So independent of the instrument itself, we might argue independent of one another. In our field, that's a lot to ask for. So it's a reasonable standard in our field, but not a high bar to jump. Promising studies would be one that have empirical support in at least one study. And if you read the literature, you'll know that there are a lot of studies out there, and a lot of those studies aren't very good. But once published, it would fall into that category. 14 out of those 21, they say are either, they're possible based on general clinical or theoretical support, or they're unlikely because there's either a lack of evidence or evidence refutes it. So here, I'll move through them quickly because, again, you can get the slides. But these would be the 5 that from, again, this study of studies back in 2006, or really earlier, they published an earlier article on this, said that these 5 have support. They said these have promise, but that's based again on just one single article, and that can be problematic because some articles aren't very good. These, they say, are possible because although there's no empirical evidence, we get a lot of authors supporting these kind of ideas as risk factors. Examples: impulsivity, sexual preoccupation, sexual offense of a male, environmental support to reoffense. And these they cite as unlikely. And if you know the field at all, there's some interesting and important ones in there for us to know about. But one is, as you can see, a history of being sexually victimized, and that varies from literature to literature, and certainly since this particular article came out. Denial. So this is part of a very clear line of thinking that says, look, denial may not be a risk factor. So these are important pieces, and certainly when they wrote the article, they saw that as having little support. And for those of you who don't know, but do know tools, you'll know the eraser, and that you'll know that Jim, in that case, you'll know that Jim Worling, who was a co-author of that particular article, is primary author of the eraser. And I say that because of this group here, Prentke colleagues, Robert Prentke and Sue Right-hand are the primary authors of the J-SOAP, and the J-SOAP and the eraser are the two most commonly used instruments, certainly in North America, but also probably across the world. But they agree, the vast majority of juvenile risk factors are weakly related to sexual offense. Most have never been examined empirically. And furthermore, risk factors that operate for somebody who's age 16 may not operate for somebody who's age 10. And the same would be true of protective factors, the sort of things that I'm not going to talk about today, that really help to buffer against risk or protect against risk. And risk factors and protective factors operate at different times in different lives. So a protective factor that's really safe, protects me from harm and risk or engaging in risk behavior, might be a stable family environment, but that's not likely to have the same level of protection when I'm 16 or 17. And the converse would be true in terms of, say, antisocial peers. It's a much more powerful risk factor at 16 than it is at, say, age 9. So that's what this next piece really addresses. Here's Vanderbilt and colleagues suggested that we shouldn't simply separate adult risk instruments from juvenile risk instruments, but even within adolescence, we should be subdividing our assessments to take into account pre-adolescents, early adolescents, older adolescents, and not, I would argue, young adults, or sometimes we call them adultolescents. And they argue that the effect of risk factors varies based on how old you are, developmentally, what's going on in your life at that time and over time. And so even though we have a developing research base, it's important for us to know, I think it's the best we've got, and I think I'm glad we have what we have. I think it certainly tells us something about risk assessment, but so far we have a weak or inconsistent literature. And as a result, what we think we know is speculative. It is useful. We'll come back to that at the very end. It is useful, but it's sort of speculative. It's sort of provisional at this time. And as Powell Sawyer and Mike Miner, who's the current ADSA president, a great deal of continued research is needed if we really want to understand more about static, historical, dynamic, current risk factors that are related to sexual recidivism among juveniles. These are some factors. I know there's a lag, so hopefully you're seeing these pretty clearly. You should see 15 of these up on the screen. Again, they're in the handout. But here what you can see are risk factors that have partial validation in the sense that they appear typically in more than one piece of literature. They may or may not appear in risk assessment instruments, but all of these have some level of support, but only partially. And I say partially because different reports come up with different results, and we've addressed a little bit of why that may be. So you should now be seeing items 16 through 30, and I won't go over any of these, but you'll have them on that handout. And if anybody again wants to get in touch with me, please feel free. The last slide or before the last slide, we'll have contact info on it. Okay, we'll do a quick intro to instruments, then we'll look at the validity and the general actual empirical support for these instruments. The instrument, it's some kind of a structured instrument or tool that we would design so that it really reduces the chances of poorly informed, poorly conducted, poorly thought through evaluations. And it's intended to give us some level of structure and support and guidance and anchor. Sometimes assessments that are done with instruments are called anchored assessments of risk. The anchor is in the instrument itself and what the instrument contains. Sometimes it's called empirically guided. Sometimes, and increasingly, it's called an instrument to aid structured professional judgment, SPJs. And we'll come back to that briefly. When we think of two types of assessments, which we're not going to describe at all, just no time. Actuarial, which is statistical assessments. We're going to find those most typically in the adult field. In terms of sexually troubled behavior, we do have one juvenile statistical tool, actuarial tool. All the remainder of the juvenile tools are clinical instruments. An actuarial instrument is always going to have a clear instrument. It's going to clearly have questions. It's going to clearly have a system for putting the information together. And that is one of the strengths, among many, of actuarial assessments. Clinical assessments, though, can also be structured professional judgment, anchored clinical assessment, guided judgment, empirically guided. These sort of instruments, even though they're clinical and begin from a clinical base rather than a statistical base, they also organize. They also help to ensure consistency. They add consistency of the process, and they also add a clear method. And increasingly, as we said, we call this guidelines for structured professional judgment. So we tend to use the term SPJ to actually refer to the instruments. When we think of instruments, briefly, we should think of at least these 14 steps, and I won't really go through them. Hopefully you're seeing them on the screen. Briefly, they've got to be comprehensive. They've obviously got to make sense. They've got to really explain themselves. They've got to have clear instructions so the user can use them. They should include both static and dynamic risk factors. And here we're really talking about clinical risk instruments, which allow us to look at the whole individual in a way that an actuarial assessment doesn't. It's got to have static factors, which sort of rules out actuarials, and it's got to have dynamic factors, current factors, things that are moving and fluid that we can exert change over, although it may be difficult. And there's got to be a range of those dynamic risk factors, and each risk factor should be well defined. It should also cover not simply one area of life, but multiple aspects of risk in different domains of life: family, peer group, individual. There should be a clear system for scoring. There should be a way, and sometimes it's built into the instrument itself, that different risk factors can be weighted differently. Some may be more significant than others in different cases. It's always going to be in every individual case. It allows us to pull the data together. It allows us to have really clear results. Even if people don't agree with us, they can see how we arrive at a conclusion. And these are clinical processes. These are structures to guide those processes. They should be oriented for the population that we're using it with. So we shouldn't use, for instance, adult instruments on adolescents. We shouldn't use instruments that are designed for females with males, etc. And it should allow us to reevaluate risk over time based on the fact that people are changing and dynamic risk factors change. So, dashing right along, let's look at the research on those instruments. These are the juvenile instruments. And look, I'm a proponent of risk assessment big time. I love the process. I love the ideas. I think it's important. And I think it's important we do something important and valuable with risk assessment. We'll come back to that at the very, very end. But the statistical news isn't really great for risk assessment instruments if the instrument is intended to predict, if you will, or estimate somebody's future behavior. And we could argue the estimate's only worth something if they're accurate. So far, really, our efforts are weak. We keep trying. We've got new instruments in development now. We keep trying. They'll no doubt get better, but I'm not sure how much better we'll get. So far, we haven't done a great job. Like the risk factors, this is the risk instruments that those factors are included in. Like that literature, this literature is mixed. It's not universal, and sometimes it's contradictory. And so overall, we have a weak literature. We seem to have hit, David mentioned earlier before we came on the air, the ROC, which is sometimes known as the AUC. ROC is a statistical procedure, receiver operator characteristics. And AUC is a particular value. It's the area under the curve. It doesn't really matter. I couldn't tell you much more about the statistics. I'm not a statistician. But I'll go through them very briefly because it's important when we understand empirical validity. That is to say, is an instrument accurate in predicting, in our case, future behavior? This has become not the only, but certainly the most common way that we've looked at predictive accuracy. So when you see an AUC value of 1, that means it's right all of the time. And when we see 50 or 0.50, it means it's accurate 50% of the time. In other words, it's pure chance. So obviously, the higher the number, the better. It's very rare, we do see it, but it's very rare when we see numbers above 0.71. And that's 71% chance of accuracy. Instruments have not got a good record of low risk. You're a pretty good, statistically good chances of getting it right. High risk, you're not at a, you've caught, it's a big net that's caught a lot of fish that shouldn't really be in it. So these instruments sometimes over respond. But having said that, the actual statistics really tell us that most of these instrument values fall between 0.63, 0.69, which is a weak level. At best, it's kind of mild. Here's Jay Singh, who's written fairly recently, done quite a bit of work, quite a bit of studies around statistics that are looking at risk assessment in particular. The value of the general adoption of the rules that we have, meaning that when we agree on AUCs, we can agree on, well, what is a small size? What's a moderate size? What's a large size? What AUCs really count? And as he writes, unfortunately, we don't have any such agreement. Here's my rule of thumb as we go through this. Again, we'll do it quickly. AUCs between 0.65, 0.70, mild accuracy. At about 0.64, they pass a test of statistical significance, but that's not necessarily the same as being accurate. So 65 to 70, mild accuracy. 71, 80, okay, I'd be kind of happy. It's difficult to get above that. Moderate. 81 above, pretty damn good. 90 above would be great. But between 50 and 60, it's just about the level of chance. So that's a general rule of thumb. But at the moment, looking at the literature we have, it would be a mistake to think of any of our instruments as empirically validated. At best, we can say, and I think reasonably we can say, they're partially validated. They've got some support, and in other areas they have little support. And I'll give you an example of that as we go through this. The literature doesn't offer a lot of support for any of the instruments being consistently valid in terms of its ability to predict what somebody might do in the future. An enormously difficult task. And quite frankly, if we assess somebody at high risk, we're likely, I hope, to provide them with an awful lot of services so they, in fact, do not reoffend. So some of our estimates may, in fact, have been correct at the time. But nevertheless, statistically, we don't see a lot of support. Statistics doesn't take that into account, which is unfortunate because it's legitimate as we try to understand the phenomenon. But statistically, we don't see consistent support. We don't see universal support. Most of the independent literature, these independent researchers suggest that the instruments are far from being empirically validated, and they really raise questions about not just being able to reliably and consistently, not just once in a while, accurately predict future risk, but there's a risk, no pun intended, in allowing weak science, if you will, to be able to, as they put it, inform public policy, juvenile court decisions, debate. And we're thinking about things like, for instance, registration of minors, for example. None of the methods used so far have really, as Michael Caldwell has said, an important player in our field and an important independent researcher who's got a lot of really great stuff to say. He said that none of the methods used have demonstrated the degree of scientific reliability that would allow an expert to rely upon them to make judgments. They're weak. Here's just several different writers. Hopefully you're seeing this. I know there's a slight lag, but hopefully it's up on your screen by now. When we've looked at inter-rater reliability, meaning when different people score the same instrument with the same information about the same client, that they come up with the same results. Is there a consistency? And certainly these three instruments, the JSOAP, the ERASER, both clinical instruments that I previously mentioned, the JSORAT2, which is the only actuarial instrument. There's certainly more to say about all of these instruments. Each of them have had some support in terms of inter-rater reliability, meaning that when different people use the instrument, they come up with the same sorts of results. However, we've still seen mixed results in this area as well. So here's Vitako and colleagues. They say, look, there just haven't been good studies that have looked at inter-rater reliability, and they think that we should be doing these inter-rater reliability studies with different populations in different treatment settings. So in a correctional setting, perhaps a group home setting, perhaps in a community-based setting. And they also talk about the importance of research that really looks at allegiance bias. That comes back into the idea that we want people doing research who are ideally independent of the research. They have nothing to gain. You know, if somebody was selling their toothpaste and they tell you that clinical trials support their toothpaste, it may be true, but there may be all sorts of other information that's missing. Allegiance bias sometimes gets in the way of people giving a really objective opinion. And so they point out that inter-rater reliability should be as much as possible free of bias. Then we shift from inter-rater reliability to predictive validity. They're not the same thing. Inter-rater reliability could be fantastic. It could be just perfect. Everybody scores it the same way. But in fact, independent of inter-rater reliability, evaluators who used the JSOP in this particular study, inter-rater reliability was high, but they were not really accurate in predicting actual recidivism. A high degree of inter-rater confidence was not associated with higher levels of accuracy. So you can see that even though an instrument may be well designed in terms of its internal construction, what holds it together, it doesn't really mean that it's going to really do what it was meant to do. It's predict. If we see these instruments as whose primary role is to predict future behavior, it's predictive validity that most distinguishes the ability of the instrument to do what it said it's going to do. Here's Prentke in right hand. They've said, look, they can't. This is 2005. There's been a little bit more research since then, but they said nothing much has changed. No definitive feedback regarding the question of predictive validity for the JSOP. But they're the authors. In sum, it is not a predictive instrument upon which we can make long-term decisions. The individual scale scores may be really useful, however, and we'll come back to that idea that there's other uses for these instruments. Here's Villon, Jody Villon and colleagues, no currently well-validated for predicting sexual recidivism among adolescents with sexually abusive behavior. Vitarco and colleagues, again, they don't perform in a manner that provides confidence regarding their ability to accurately predict juvenile sexual recidivism. Here's Ray Knight, Scott Ronas, Barry Zucchera, similar, right? Poor results for the JSOP, the eraser, the JSOP3. There are so many other instruments. I'm the proud author of one of them. There's more coming. But these are the three main instruments at the moment. Inconsistent poor results in terms of their accuracy. However, despite really inconsistent reports, mild support, none of them has, they all have partial validity. They all have some support, but none of them has a consistently demonstrated record or history of really consistent predictive validity. This results in the conclusion that instruments don't perform in a manner that, again, it suggests that they're highly tuned in. And again, here are several of those articles. They're all in the handout in terms of the references. So, in their review, similar things. Predictive validity is insufficient to accurately predict recidivism. This is an interesting one. These guys, Rajlik and Greton, they found lots of differences in the JSOP based on which population you used it with. When they looked at sexual-only recidivists, this is kids who really engage in no other crime. That's a high AUC point. That's pretty good. I'd be happy, really happy with that. But when they looked at sexual recidivism for juvenile sexual offenders who committed sexual and non-sexual crimes, it couldn't get much lower in terms of having any mean. 0.50, that's 0.51. 0.50 is pure risk. However, when we aggregate scores, and I'm going to kind of hurry on now, we've got a really handful more slides to go. But Villon and colleagues, they did a meta-analysis where you scrunch together and you do statistical analysis on a number of studies. They scrunched together 33 studies, 6,000 adolescent offenders, and they ultimately pulled out of it an aggregated AUC of 0.67. But even that is not great, but that's okay. But it's not great. It's almost like we couldn't do much better. For the JSOP, 0.67, for the eraser, 0.66, for the JSOP, I'm sorry, 0.64, just below that level. But none of those numbers are really great. But it also tells us that this is all the numbers put together, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It gives us a sense that outcomes can be inconsistent based on the way that we design our study. And the study design itself may have an effect on the result. In this case, it is that aggregated score that kind of just slides by. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I'm not going to go through it. This is just to use the JSOP because the JSOP has had the greatest number of studies, and not that many. But you can see, if you look down each column, right, vertically, up and down, you can see the consistencies and the inconsistencies from study to study. Rajlik and Greton's on this screen, it shows in red. That's the one that looked at the two different groups of sexually abusive youth. And some of them, when they say not significant, means that they used a different method, but they didn't reach statistical significance. And finally, at the bottom, I just added it. You can see Martinez and colleagues. You can see they didn't score them by individual subscale, but you can see there's as well. That just gives you a sort of sense of the ups and downs, the good, the bads, and the ugly. Cautions, Villon and colleagues, mixed results, even though they came in with support, and I think want to support these tools. But they go on to say that, look, risk assessment instruments, they're just not sufficient enough to predict things in a very precise way, like civil commitment, for instance. and things like that. So they're delicate. Current instruments, important developmental milestones, but far from complete. And we do have other models that are in development. At the moment, research, not necessarily clinical practice, but research doesn't support the use of any of these instruments. No single instrument or combination seems to have adequate enough power. Until new instruments are better validated, evaluation will remain a complex balancing act. I think they said it very well. Elizabeth Letourneau there, she's the outgoing president of ATSA. And David, by the way, who I'm privileged to have introduced me today, thank you, David, is a former president of ATSA, Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. Until then, we're going to have to kind of balance, as they put it, the need to provide people with information and the limitations in scientifically precise information about risk. Last few slides, but they say, look, even though they're aimed at prediction, the benefits are above pure chance, unstructured assessments. And they say that even though our research focuses on sexual recidivism, the instruments are also meant to help us manage risk, right, and prevent reoffense. They argue it goes beyond the tools just to somehow estimate what somebody might do, go beyond prediction to really look at prevention. And that, of course, is the goal. Prentke and colleagues, the same. Useful for making short-term decisions, especially useful for guiding effective treatment interventions. Here's Steve Benjes, a dear friend. Some of you will know Steve. Steve began the NERI Press. Steve passed away very briefly. It's always an honor actually to even mention Steve's name. Passed away recently, excuse me. A wonderful guy, and here's Steve with David Prescott and Joan Trubachnik, who normally would introduce the series, who write a very excellent newsletter that comes out about once a month or once every 6 weeks or so, worth getting from the NERI Press. They say, look, using risk assessment measures by which they mean instruments to guide safety, to manage risk, to case management, treatment planning may be a better way to proceed than just making statements about risk. That's our last slide. So let me actually take my last couple of moments to say that I think that sort of sums up that our ability to go regardless, or if you will, independently of the empirical literature, which I think is important, absolutely worth a great deal to us. I think there's also the value, the clinical value day-to-day of using the instruments, and particularly looking at the whole child on an individualized basis. And importantly, really using this as a guide, we can recognize the preponderance of risk factors, if you will. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody's going to reoffend again or not, but it can tell us something about the kid's needs at the moment. And that's really what this last slide is about. There's my email at the very bottom. There's my website. You can always find me if you just Google in Phil Rich. I'm not the Apostle Phil Rich. I'm the other one. And I'm not the swing band from Maine. Here's the next two sessions, the 17th and the 24th, and what they look at. Next time we'll look at comprehensive risk assessment and the assessment report, and then we'll look at really a case study on that very last episode. We'll look at how we can really use these instruments. You'll see from the handout that all the references that I made are there. I hope that you can read them right now. Good job, too late. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to hand it back to David now, and then we'll wind up doing question and answers. So I think, David, it should be back to you now.
That sounds good. Yes, oh. Phil, thank you. That was unbelievable. And you got through all of those slides right down to the minute. And here we are at 3:40. So I'm going to wait to see whether or not there's any questions from the participants. But I very definitely have some questions that I don't believe will get too far into the way of your upcoming presentations. Maybe just the first, but well, before I ask a question, I just have to say that is a ton of information. And as I'm looking at the dates on the studies that you mentioned, it is remarkable how much we've learned in just the past 10 years, much less the past 30 or 35 years. To my knowledge, the first program for the treatment of kids who are sexually abused, the first dedicated program to it started in 1978. In the Pacific Northwest, and to think about how far our information has come in that time, and yet how much of the published studies we see that say more research is needed. You know, we are not there yet. So a quick clarifying question. You said at one point an AUC of 0.50. I think I heard you say was about half risk. I think what you
No,
meant to say was about halfway, or the same as flipping a coin.
I may have said the wrong. Yeah, a 0.50 is pure chance.
Yep.
So an AUC of 0.5 is you could flip a coin and come up with exactly the same. So I'm not sure. Did that not come? Did I not get that
I
across?
think it might have been a slip of the tongue, so I was
Okay.
just trying to get your back for you.
So it's not halfway.
Oh,
Just to be clear, it's not 50% that you're right. It's 50%. It means it's a pure guess.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah.
And in fact, there may even be a seductive quality to an AUC of 0.5 because you'll still be right half the time.
Well, it gets in. No. Well, that's true, but it would be by pure chance. That's true.
Yeah, by pure
You can get
chance,
one at
right?
least half the time. Yeah, and it could be the 50% you get are all wrong. Or you get the 50% are all right. But that's a good point. But when you start to see negative correlations, negative AUCs, when you see an AUC of say 0.25, which would be the equivalent of an AUC of 7.5, there's some kind of obverse, correlation going on there. That would be also useful to know about, actually.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Wow, I suppose, yes, it absolutely would be. And so I guess where all of this is leading us, well, let me ask something else. I'm sure that there's an audience member wondering about the role of the autistic spectrum in all of this. Do you know of any studies that have really looked at kids that have the condition formerly known as Asperger's?
Yeah. There are some papers that are published that address the issue in general, how to maybe best work with these kids, or how to best understand these kids, or an approach to take, or materials. Um, but I've never. And then there's a little bit of work with the adult intellectually disabled population that has led to some specific instruments for the depopulation of adults. But I've never read anything that really has addressed Asperger's in particular, or really any of the autistic spectrum and its effect. I, I, in fact, I was just looking for papers on ASD. I didn't find very much. Do you know of
Sure.
anything?
I don't. I'll tell you what I do know, and I'm really interested in your thoughts, is I've heard some people say, look, the samples are the samples that these instruments have been studied on, and doubtless some of the kids in those samples were someplace on the spectrum or had interesting learning disabilities that might have been along very similar lines. And so you should use these instruments with some degree of caution, but also some degree of confidence. I've heard other people say, until we have studies that have normed these instruments, for lack of a better term, specifically on kids who are on the spectrum, then you should approach these instruments with not just caution, but maybe even a degree of prejudice.
Yeah, I think we should be careful. Look, the eraser, for those, some of you will know the eraser and the J. So those are the most commonly, and those are you can argue the most, they're like the equivalent. They're quite different, but this different in some ways. And but there are kind of significant differences, and one of them is that the J soap says it's for hands-on contact defenses only, whereas the eraser says, nah, yeah, and it may be a reflection of the authors. I don't know. It's like dogs come to look like us, or we come to look like our dogs. But it's more like back, and it says, and it also says you can use it for girls and not just boys. And I think that is Jim Worley's kind of mindset. Look, kids are kids, different parts of the world and different. Of course, there are differences, and be careful. And Jim does it, and Tracy, who wrote the original version, I think they did a good job of saying, look, here's the research, and for the girls one, for instance, it says, be cautious. So I think I just repeated really what David said, but I think that's the thinking, is that, you can use these instruments, but be careful. Some of you will know the armadillo, which is an adult instrument for intellectually disabled, and for a while, and I'm not sure where it's at this point, there was an aim to do a youth version of it, which I think would be welcome. But again, this is aimed at the intellectually disabled rather than autistic spectrum disorder specifically. And it didn't really look much like a special instrument. It looked like a good instrument, but didn't look like it was aimed for the cognitively impaired kids. But beyond that, I don't think anybody's addressed anything that's more finely tuned to autistic spectrum kids, including high functioning kids. I think they're either treated like the rest of the population, or the intellectually disabled population, depending on how functioning they are, rather than having, you know, a specialized form of treatment, or whether they even need a specialized form of treatment, you know. So I don't know. I think it's a great question, because it's a good question. There's no, I don't think there's an answer for it yet, anyway.
Yeah, I guess that's where I come down as well, you know, up to this point. And just a small comment. I think you're absolutely right about the authors of these measures really being highly cautious about their use. And this is such a complicated, I guess I wonder if you have any further comment on it. This is a complicated issue. I've seen Sue Righthand at the ATSA conference actually say, you know, we got to a point in researching this where we actually thought we should maybe shelve the whole thing. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the JSOAP is free to use. It's in the public domain. The same thing, having seen Jim Whirling present, he's a brilliant and very decent, very ethical guy who says, sort of, on the one hand, you're the professional. Here's the scale. You figure it out. Please be very cautious with this. And on the other hand, he mentions examples of good risk assessment procedures that have gone terribly wrong with disastrous results that he hopes never to see happen again. These kinds of things really force all of our hands in terms of engaging them in the most ethical and educated practices possible. Did I miss anything?
No. I mean, that underlies it all, doesn't it? It's be ethical about your practice. And part of that, only one part, is making sure that you're well informed and that you know, you do know the strengths of these instruments, but you also know the limitations and the weakness of these instruments, so that you're not, you know, you don't fall onto one side or the other. You know, I think that as clinicians, we need to be, and that the people who produce these instruments, I think, do a great job. You know, that they try, you know, they put a lot into them, so nobody's just kind of knocked one off quickly. So I think David's right. There's an ethics below this all, and the ethics are partly get trained and you get the kind of supervision and support you need.
Yeah, yeah, very nice. Let me just think for a second about my next question. I noticed that you didn't talk a lot about the base rates of reoffense, and I don't know if that's coming up later, or.
Yeah, I mean, it's a
Okay.
second. It's a second. You know, low, but and the reason really was, I think, if we had known that the first one was going to be related to the next three, but we didn't. So it was a matter of what do you not put in. The base rates are low. The base rates, I think, most typically, and David can certainly add to this, most typically people cite, and in the literature, which is a real patchwork, but about 10 to 15%. You see literature that goes to 3%, 5%, 7%. There was an article fairly recently, which I've never been able to find again, so I can't do the quote from it, but that said, you know, it's probably lower. It probably is in the 3 to 7% range. So certainly, if you said somewhere between 8 and 16%, you're in the accurate rate. That's a low base rate. It's a higher base rate for non-sexual offenses. David.
Nice. The reason I asked is because some people say start with the base rate before you even use a scale. And Phil, while you were speaking, I saw a bunch of questions come in. So, so you can. I'm sure you'll be coming back to this. Let me just ask. Here's a real simple question from Anne. Do you have a recommendation for a risk assessment instrument for non-sexual reoffending that is either free or low cost? My first thought is the LSI. The variations of the LSI.
The LSI and the SAVRI, you know, both.
Yeah.
The LSI is the level of service inventory level of service / case management inventory. They're not free. I don't really know how much they cost. And if you email me, if you just write it down, you'll find it. So that's what Dave is talking about, which is it's an instrument for general recidivism. It's got in effect, a case planning section. You know, there's multiple stages to it. It was designed originally for probation officers, counselors. You know, so it's got a wide range, and it shows it asks you to think about strengths as well. So that is a nice instrument. I don't know the cost. It's probably not too expensive. The other is the SAVRI, which is the Structured Adolescent Violence Risk in Youth. I like that. It's also got a protective factor scale in it. You know, that might be about the same price. I don't really know, the SAVRI. The problem with the SAVRI is it requires you to put the youth psychopathy score in there. So if you don't do psychopathic assessments of youth or the adolescent version, you're kind of screwed. Because they asked, I think they asked for the score for the hair psychopathology, psychopathology checklist for youth, a youth version. There are other scales. I think this just came up the other day on the listserv, actually. Yeah, it's a listserv. So that's one downside to the SAVRI, because then you get to that and you think, oh, what do I do here? Anyway, those are the two.
Yeah, those are the two I would have mentioned as well. Level of service, case management, inventory, structured assessment of violence risk in youth. Those are pretty good, I think. Yes, under $100. The next one is a recommendation for risk assessment for females who have sexually abused. Boy, there's a tough one.
Yeah, well, okay. I said already, the eraser has said you can use this with girls, so you can use it with girls. And it says be cautious. The MEGA, which we haven't mentioned, I can't tell at the top of my head what MEGA stands for. It's got about 8 words in it. I've got it
multiplex. Yeah.
Multiplex, empirically aggregated, kind of groups of, yeah. But there are several downsides to the use of the MEGA, but the MEGA is normed on both kids of wide range from 5 through 19, which is enormous, and also boys and girls, and also all IQs. And she has good sample sizes in the research. But the downside of the MEGA is it costs you money. You have to do a 2-day training unless they've relaxed, and that's really for inter-rater reliability, so people know how to use the instrument. GIFR, Global Institute of Forensic Research, which is Jay Singh. You easily just type in GIFR, you'll find it. They have a lot of good trainings. Jay's doing I think it's a 2-day MEGA training, and if that works, you can that's a much easier way to get certified, and it makes it available to everybody. And it costs you per evaluation, so that's another. And the other thing is that you do the evaluation in the sense that you complete the checklist, but you send it in and you get a report back, so it's a black box kind of model.
Yeah.
But that's also, has been designed with females in mind.
Excellent.
Other than that, yeah, that's it.
I'll also mention Sue Robinson. I'm just looking at the time. I'll also mention Sue Robinson's work. She's published a lot with NERI, including in a book that I did. So just contact me if you're interested in that. She's done some good stuff. Another question, a really good one from Laura. This might be a little bit philosophical, but she asks, what's the utility of examining static factors in a juvenile risk assessment if it's something that can't be, that they can't change?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, but remember, Phil is the first part of philosopher, so philosophical question right up my alley. Also, Philistine. Okay, because it helps us to understand what happened, and it helps us not just to understand the beings, like how many beings were there, why are those beings there? What was going on? What were really dynamic factors at that time? Because the only difference between some of the dynamic factors and static factors is the dynamic factors. Well, the static factors continued to live. It didn't just stop then. It continued, and so that person's pervasive anger, he's still angry, or she, probably he, but she as well. So that's the value. Otherwise it's like blinders. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter what happened. And other statistical analyses in terms of antisocial behavior tell us that a history of antisocial behavior predicts future. It doesn't mean in every case. So when you look at DSM, you'll see that conduct disorder early onset is statistically, prognostically worse because of the early onset. So there is value both in terms of understanding the early problems that tell you something, and in terms of understanding, well, what is it that actually happened and how much of that is still present in this kid's life today.
Nice. Excellent. We've got a few minutes left. We've got one question left here from Anne. That's another really good one. I'm very interested in your answer, Phil. I certainly have thoughts of my own, which is, how does personality disorder diagnosis affect risk, particularly schizotypal personality disorder?
Right. Well, big. Most of I shouldn't say, I think all of the risk assessment instruments for adults and kids and the non-sexual risk assessments don't really look at mental health, because there hasn't really been anything that links mental health. And it might, to be clear, for the individual, it might, but for the group as a whole, it really doesn't. And studies that look at violence among the mentally ill, and you know, it depends on how you conceptualize, you know, personality disorder, but certainly psychiatric hospitals in the United States are full of people with personality disorders, not people that we would have once thought of as insane, you know, schizophrenia, for instance, although, of course, there's plenty of folks who experience schizophrenia there. But so personality disorder is considered to be, you know, mental health disorder, obviously. Um, and so there's plenty of literature that has said that the mentally ill, of course, there's a violent subset, but it's a subset. So just to distinguish those two things from both ends, both the sexual violence end and the general violence end, they're not really correlated. But in an individual's case, they are. So then you come to personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder, which, you know, is clearly potentially related because of some of the core features, callousness and superficial relationships and exploiting people. And on the other hand, schizoid personality disorder, which some people think of as either a rudimentary form of schizophrenia, or so it is schizophrenia, or a precursor to schizophrenia, which it often statistically is. So it's an oddness, and I don't know it's right for us to call that personality. So I think of it as the way the personality is organized, you know. And so I think, of course, with an individual, it may really, you know, I think that we've seen deaths that are related to people having some form of schizoid behavior, where they're completely cut off and distant, and it's almost a surgical, you know, objective experience that they're not connected to. So that's what I think.
Yeah, fascinating. And I was also thinking that personality disorders, and especially schizotypy, is so much about how somebody functions in the world, that I also go to the risk factor of how socially isolated are they as a result of this
Right.
personality structures. So
Right.
I always say, I wish we could get all of our kids to feel more competent in their interpersonal relationships. So I made an executive decision during all of this. By the way, Anne and Laura, thank you for these excellent questions that I wouldn't have thought of myself. Very definitely thank you. And I made an executive decision, since my introduction went a little bit long, to skip over some of the final slides. Phil, obviously, on behalf of NERI and myself, thank you for an excellent part one of this webinar. I want to also call to everybody's attention that that we'll try to make all of these handouts available, including, I'm going to say, even the slides that I've been working off of, because I just want to call to your attention that NERI Press has a fantastic website. You can sign up for a monthly newsletter that we do every month. Phil has some excellent trainings coming up in both June and October. These are deep dish events. October 17th through the 19th, June 6th through the 10th. NERI's putting all of these on. We've got other kinds of webinars coming up. I'm going to be doing a consultanar, looking for any clinician with a difficult case. So Anne or Laura or anybody else, if you want to be on one of these webinars discussing a difficult case, please feel free to contact me or NERI. And I also want to say a huge thank you for all of our various sponsors, from Yara Counseling to St. Mary's Home to the Leo Hoffman Center in Minnesota, Jarina and Associates, the Crime Prevention Branch, etc. I'm going to make sure that everybody has a list of the sponsors. That brings us right up to 4 o'clock. Phil,
David,
any last words?
I just have to say, it's a pleasure watching you. That's great.
It's great watching how you get through all of those slides, Phil. So, listen, folks, I hope to be able to present Phil again next week if I possibly can. And otherwise, Phil, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.